I have a supernatural voice. I speak without the use of vocal cords. This is not a known alternative speech production process. My voice was given to me by the Lord Jesus Christ. You will learn by watching my testimony that my voice is different to any voice known to you. My name is Neels Cornelissen, and this is my story. The voice that you now hear is a voice without the use of vocal cords. I lost the use of my vocal cords and the ability to speak after an operation. Competing in a natural world, where if you miss your turn to speak, you might never regain that moment. For a while, I lived a withdrawn, quiet lifestyle with the absolute minimum form of communication. During a period of 3.5 years, I spent a lot of time looking for ways to better my quality of life. After I received this new voice, this voice that you are witnessing right now, I realized that all the techniques that I practiced for many years and well trained and mastered all form part of my new sound production process. When I initially produced sounds, I had no idea where it was coming from. I knew it was not coming via my vocal cords. How did this happen? You are about to find out. For you to understand and for you to comprehend my supernatural new voice, you need to have some insight about my techniques that I developed. The period after the operation was devastating. Without my only way of communication, my ability to speak. In a short time, I taught myself an alternative speech. I was communicating with sucking sounds. My wife and 2 sons could understand what I was communicating to them. This part of my testimony formed part of my greater testimony of how it is possible for me to speak without the use of vocal cords. In the previous episode, I shared with you my air swallowing technique that I used mainly to combat acid burning in the esophagus and upper part of my stomach. In this video, I am sharing a part of my testimony, not in all detail, but enough to tell my story. I had to learn various survival techniques. I lost my ability to speak after a total esophagectomy operation or gastric pull-up in 2012. I was told that I will never be able to speak again. All these survival techniques that I learned over many years was God's ultimate plan to give me a new voice without the use of vocal cords. Let's pause and go back in time before the operation in 2012. The food swallowing technique that I want to share with you today is very effective to increase the greater force necessary when swallowing food, when having an obstruction in the esophagus. This technique is an added technique to the normal swallowing procedure. This technique is very effective to increase the normal swallowing force that is required to swallow food down the esophagus into the stomach. This is a swallowing technique that can be followed when the normal swallowing is inadequate to swallow food when having an obstruction inside the esophagus. I am sure that everybody sometime in their life needed to swallow very hard to propel the food into the stomach. It is not always a pleasant experience, depending on the obstruction inside the feeding tube. Little did I know, about 10 years ago, when I mastered this technique, it would also become a vital procedure in my later and earlier sound production process. I have no approved medical background or any medical qualifications. This swallowing technique I developed based on my personal experiences and knowledge. This is a basic step-by-step description based on how I think, feel, and experience when carrying out this technique. I developed this technique as a survival technique to ensure food intake as a result of a 45,4 carcinoma, a cancer tumor inside my esophagus. Without any medical assistance, I had to find a way to be able to feed myself. My technique prevented a feeding tube or PEG to be placed through the abdominal wall into my stomach. This technique was necessary when hard swallowing was no more adequate. We take for granted something that we do many times each day, like swallowing. Most of the time, we don't even think about it. Swallowing is a natural process and is controlled by an involuntary autonomic nerve system. The very moment when food gets stuck inside the feeding tube, we suddenly become aware of this process. Depending on the severity, we may even panic or be fearful. During this state of panic, you swallow as hard as you can or try to regurgitate as hard as you can. Always a massive relief afterwards. Before the next swallow, you will make sure that the food bolus is not only smaller, but also well masticated. I have learned to celebrate the gift of swallowing and to give thanks to our Creator for this amazing process of swallowing. This is a technique that I do. It works very effective for me. I don't recommend you to do this. I share this technique with you because in my greater testimony, you will have a greater understanding from where this was coming from. My technical background enabled me to apply valuable principles of the functioning of a diaphragm pump that enhanced my swallowing ability. Let me take you through the process of swallowing. The process of chewing or mastication is the process by which the teeth ground and crush the food. The food bolus or food ball is formed inside the mouth. The food bolus between the tongue and the hard palate is rolled back and assists the tongue to push the uvula or soft palate back up. The food ball is transferred into the pharynx. The pharynx consists of three parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The uvula closes the nasopharynx and breathing is stopped. The laryngeal muscles contracts further and the larynx will move upwards. The epiglottis shut or closes the glottis or air passage at the top of the larynx to prevent any swallowing down into the larynx. Your vocal cords will shut closed as a secondary stage of safety precaution. During the pharyngeal stage, food is propelled down into the pharynx and further down the esophagus into the stomach by the process of peristalsis. How could I apply the principle and functioning of a diaphragm pump to enhance my swallow capacity? The flexibility and amount of movement the diaphragm allows depends on the output capacity of the pump. I knew that if I could apply this principle, I would be able to enhance my capacity of swallowing. my best hard swallow was insufficient to push any food or liquid past my tumour inside my feeding tube. I was trapped in a moment in my life that I was not able to feed myself. I was forced to come up with a plan to be able to feed myself. I didn't want a feeding tube implant. How could I apply a technical principle to increase the capacity of my swallowing? With every swallowing attempt, I studied every organ and every muscle in my swallowing process by a process of thinking, hearing, or listening and experiencing every stage of the swallowing process. I became aware of the impact and intensity of every muscle and organ during the swallowing. I discovered that my tongue, the diaphragm of my pump, must have hidden potential that was still locked up, unused. The diaphragm pump operating procedure is very similar than the swallowing procedure. I knew that I needed to decrease the size of my pharynx chamber. To be able to do that, I will increase the output of my swallowing process. While studying my tongue and muscles, I learned that my tongue had the potential to increase my swallowing. I discovered that I had the capacity locked up on the inside of me. I could move my tongue further back and down into my oropharynx. This was a major breakthrough that gave me the ability to again feed myself. As the tumour grew larger, these results were no more sufficient. The tumour not only filled the inside of my esophagus, but was pushing my esophagus from the inside outwards like a balloon. I was starving to death. I could feel my life was fading away. I was and is still a fighter. Advice my late father gave to me as a little boy was never to surrender and never to give up. This philosophy that was imprinted in my character built led me to major victories in my life. I was certainly not going to surrender or give up. I forced myself back to the drawing board. The larynx is an amazing organ and is a very tough component. The larynx skeleton is made out of a soft bone or cartilage and has got the potential to enhance and to further assist in the swallowing process. The larynx is a tubular structure situated at the top of the windpipe. It houses the very important vocal cords, and it prevents this part to collapse. When the larynx collapses, breathing will become difficult, and the vocal cords will not be able to produce the correct vibration sounds. When the larynx moves up in the swallowing process to assist the swallowing, it pulls open the laryngopharynx, which is attached to the larynx. Have you watched the baby bird feeding her babies? The moment the mother bird enters the nest, the baby bird's beak will open spontaneously, even if the eyes are not yet opened. This assists the mother bird to be able to feed her babies a lot easier. The opening of the laryngopharynx. This function assists the food flowing into the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx is a flattened tube fitted with circular muscles to ensure peristaltic motion. Now the laryngopharynx contracts and further propels the food down by the process of peristalsis. This is a normal process. To enhance the swallowing process in the area of the laryngopharynx and to assist the muscular contraction of peristalsis, I realized that the larynx was the best organ to assist in this needed requirement. In the normal swallowing process, the process is autonomic or automatic. The larynx moves up to assist with the food to enter into the laryngopharynx. And then the larynx follow down with the peristaltic down movement and the laryngopharynx to its rest position. The larynx and the laryngopharynx are two separate tubes. They are attached all the way down with muscles. They are not totally independent. They are wonderfully designed to work wonderfully together. To incorporate the larynx with increased downward pressure, I needed to use my larynx by using my laryngeal and pharyngeal muscles to flatten my already flattened laryngopharynx back against my spine. This is maximum flattening pressure. The next step was to keep the larynx in that position with increased pressure and to synchronize the downward force by rubbing my laryngopharynx against my spine. until the food enters the esophagus. The muscles relax and the larynx move forward into a rest position. The larynx was actually tilting back in the downward action. Food is propelled further down the esophagus into the stomach. This was a survival technique with which I was able to feed myself, to prevent myself receiving a feeding tube during the last days before I was operated on. During the last 2 weeks before the operation, this technique was also not adequate anymore. I needed more pressure to be able to swallow. Although with an already weak and malnutrition body, this did not prevent my will to survive of hunger. I looked at a doorpost of an open door and I realized there was more potential to explore. I positioned my back and spine against the doorpost and pushed back as hard as I could by stretching my shoulders out and around the doorpost. This worked and I was able to feed myself little bits of food and a quarter of teaspoon of water at a time. This was an uncomfortable process to the already painful swallowing process. This was not easy because of the large tumor inside my esophagus. By using these techniques, I was able to feed myself for 5 months. This was not by all means easy, not by any stretch of the imagination, because of the intense pressure required to perform these techniques and the pain that I had experienced. This was very uncomfortable, but I had no option. I had nobody to assist or help me. I was left on my own to fight my own battle. I was not ready to reveal my inability to cope. I was fighting to maintain a life that was most treasured and was certainly worth fighting for. I continually needed to reset my mind, to be positive and to encourage myself to be strong and courageous, and to handle every minute as an extension to my life. I know that there are many millions of very strong and very courageous friends out there that know exactly what I am talking about. People that was also in a similar position and even worse, that understand the amount of endurance required to survive such trauma. Please note, this is my swallowing technique I developed under my personal conditions after an cancer tumor developed inside my esophagus in the late 2011. Don't miss this future episode. I want to leave you with this promise. The Bible tells us in Mark 9 and verse 23, Jesus said to them, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Just prior to this declaration from Jesus, from verse 17, a man brought his son to Jesus who had a mute spirit. He told Jesus that he spoke with the disciples to cast the demon out, but they could not. Note that Jesus, Peter, James, and John just returned from the Mount of Transfiguration to join up with the rest of the disciples and the crowd of people. Jesus also directed his promise to the Father of the Son. If you can believe, and that all things are possible to him who believes. This promise gave him access to the legal right to put a demand on what is available from Jesus to him. Now comes the condition: who believes. If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. My prayer for you is for God to bless you all. Till we meet again, and goodbye.